Only took 4 levels of talk about a good example of wisdom, of looking at all the different angles and going, really? So it was like the teams that they played that won the most games by 1 game, I think, was how the 4th level was. Were their opponents, what were their records? So we are glad you were here. Today is week 10, the final hurrah of Growing in Wisdom. Glad you could all make it. If you have questions, shoot up your arm and Sir Mike will run those to you. The Mike. Let's bow as we ask God's guidance in this today. Father, we thank you for the chance to be here today. Such an honor and blessing to be able to come to this building and be able to meet with people that we love and care about, and the people that you have chosen for us to be together with as church family, to grow in wisdom and love. And we just pray that we can take these principles, these things you brought to us through your word, to be able to hammer out questions, decisions, challenges, issues, problems that come up in the future. We thank you for the promise of that you gave us in James and throughout all the wisdom literature, and we just ask for that today in Jesus' name. Amen. So as we have moved along in this class, we've really been emphasizing wisdom. But from day one, we've seen that if we're going to talk about wisdom, we're going to be talking about a lot of different kinds of things, because that's the name of the game. How to be able to make decisions in our families, at our workplaces, and at our churches that are controversial, that there are 2 sides to that we have to work through and figure out. Today, we're going to center on sort of the final area. We've talked about how fear is just the biggest enemy to this balance that we have to find in finding wisdom throughout our lives, whether it's confidence versus humility, independence versus dependence in our relationships, and on and on and on and on, covering kind of everything we live in life. And that fear is the universal amplifier that tends to make us just wow out from each other. And, you don't have to look very far, just open up a newspaper, especially during a time of election, and you see that polarization that takes place, between different parties. Well, the same thing happens in our families. As a marriage counselor, watching a couple that then polarizes from each other, and they become opposites, and one becomes the penny pincher, one becomes the spendthrift, one becomes the night person, one becomes the morning person, one becomes the Utes fan, one becomes the BYU fan. No, just as an alumnus of BYU, and Pam as a 4-year scholarship athlete for the University of Utah. No, we never did really disagree about this. I cheer for BYU anytime they're not playing Utah. So, but it's like that throughout life, isn't it? I mean, it's just everything. There's opposite points of view. There's different ways to make pie. As we saw last Wednesday, that it's kind of fun to go down the line. I kind of counted maybe upwards of 50 pies. Would that be a good estimate? Maybe more. Could have been 70. It was a lot. We had a really good turnout. Thank you, everybody, for contributing to that. But it's kind of funny to go from this pecan pie to this pecan pie to this pecan pie, right? It's a good thing Will's not here. He would have to correct me every time. But it's like that's part of the richness of life. But the theme of our generation is that we have such richness that then we really get lost in this part, the relationship part. And so I really want to focus on this as the last piece of our class this time. We've been in 1 Corinthians quite a lot. We've gone from James, looking at a lot of scriptures in James, to Romans, to 1 Corinthians. And let's just look at this, where Paul then, now remember, this is the guy that a few chapters before has said, I don't really care what you guys think about me. He says, I don't really care what I think about myself. The only one worthy of judging me is God. And now in his very flip-floppy way, right? And that's when you look at these teachings and you see a lot of critics of Christian apologists or anybody else who will look at this and go, see, Paul contradicts himself. But when you think about it this way, it's not a contradiction, nor is God a contradiction when you see him leaning one way one day and leaning another way, being merciful and kind and then holding us accountable the day after. That's really what wisdom is. So he says, just as he begins this chapter, if I had the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that could move mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. So he says, I could know all wisdom and all knowledge. I could have faith enough to move mountains, but if I don't have this, then I have nothing. So today I want to finish with this, because to be able to be wise and to be able to find that balance, you have to be good in relationships. If you look back to our description from James 3:17, where James then is describing and saying the wisdom from above is, first of all, pure, peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruit, unwavering and without hypocrisy. Look at how much of that is relationship oriented. Peace and mercy, slowing down, really listening to somebody else. He goes on then to describe this, that, love is patient, love is kind, it doesn't envy, it doesn't boast, it's not proud, it's not rude, it's not self-seeking, it's not easily angered, it keeps no records of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices in the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. So again, here's Paul giving us the description, as we looked at in Galatians 5, of if you're walking in wisdom, walking in the Spirit, walking in love, you're going to be patient and kind. You're not going to let envy and boasting and pride start to creep in. It's never rude. It's not self-seeking. It's not easily angered. Now think about this specifically in the most intimate relationships that you have. He is specifically saying here that love is not something that is easily angered, that you don't get selfish. And this is, we talked about that, how having a good, strong sense of self is really important. Love your neighbor as yourself. And then we start to go towards selfishness and even narcissism. And well, why do we usually do that? It's often because we're so afraid of being humiliated that our sense of self has been attacked, and the best defense is a good offense. And so that's why where he's talking here in love, that anger, pride, envy, boasting, taking things personally really just negates all of that. Keeping no record of wrongs. And this is really not going to be about 1 Corinthians 13. I just wanted to put this up to see the list of going, do you get the persona of wisdom? That I'm quick to erase wrongs, that I don't keep a record, a ledger is really the Greek word that's there. I'm not looking for the things that go wrong. Ha! Gotcha! I knew it. I knew that. Someone who's loving doesn't do that. We're looking for the best. And that's really what he says then in this description of these four, that it always protects, trusts, hopes, and perseveres. It believes all things and hopes all things in that other person, and love never fails. Now, again, we can use this scripture to say, see, love is the only thing, and so we really need to keep believing and trusting and forgiving everything. And it reaches the point of absurdity to go, do we never hold anybody accountable to anything? Can we ever stand up for my opinion instead of the others? And of course, we've discussed this kind of at length, that it is so important to then speak the truth in love. It's okay to reprove, rebuke, and exhort, as long as we do that with incredible gentleness and patience. You kind of see the trend here. So today, if somebody could help me pass these out. I actually have a handout. We are going to look at Lou's 6 rules for communication. And nobody can read that, so we'll blow these up here in a minute. But for those of you who are online, at the end of this, I'm going to put up my email address, and if you want, and if any of you want that as well, it's in the church directory. So It's not exactly hidden, but you can email me and I'll send you a digital copy of this if you'd like. I'm always embarrassed to tell my clients that after 43 years of postdoctoral practice, this is the only handout that I have. But it's also kind of poignant as to this one is really important. These I get to be, if I ever become a little bit pseudo-Nazi-like, it's about these 6 rules. So let's go to rule number 1, which is a really odd rule for a guy who specializes in marriage and family therapy. I went to Brigham Young University in, I'm not going to tell you what year it was. It was a million years ago. I was only 12 when I first went. Because it was the #1 school in the country for marriage and family therapy. And marriage and family therapy is really about the relationships and the systems and the interactions. And yet, many, many years later, my first rule is I am 100% individually responsible for what I do, what I say, and yes, even how I feel. Now, that's tricky. There are some of my colleagues that would disagree. But having specialized and sat and watched couples and relationships all of my professional life, I still believe that, paradoxically, again, the first rule of a good relationship is take responsibility for yourself. Don't blame the other person for the way you feel. You make me so mad. It drives me nuts when you. Okay, there's no really adequate, good, positive response to that. You're blaming the other person for the way you feel. Now, do we just let them off the hook and let them do anything? No. We can still hold them accountable, but the first step is to take responsibility for you being proactive and not being reactive. Is there anything in life that really justifies us becoming fear-based and reactive? And I kid you not, if we were in the middle of a world war, if the world was just falling apart around our ears, and read some of those biographies of people who lived back then, to go, if you don't make this shift out of fear and go into faith, you will not last very long, even in the most life-threatening circumstances. So we are responsible as to whether we are proactive and flip that switch or whether we become reactive. Does that make sense? Yes.
In all cases, when we say, you made me do that, I have automatically given control to you.
Yeah.
You had no control until I gave it to you.
Yep. And it's immediately adversarial because you're blaming the other person. And, you know, and by the way, the most common human response is to get defensive and then defend yourself. Now, I don't recommend that because I still think, even if you're attacked, that being faithful, proactive, keeping your strength is the best way to go. Now, here's the best part of rule number 1. The other person also needs to be responsible for their stuff. You need to allow them to be responsible for their reactions. Okay, now, again, you could take this too far. Well, I don't have any responsibility for you, and I'm sorry that you choose to be such a weirdo. It's like, no, that's not the point of it. But so often I see somebody trying to fix the other person. You know, we men are kind of famous for that, of trying to fix things. And it's like there are times when you really need to work out how to be able to let that person go off and kind of get themselves back into a good spot. We'll cover this more in detail as we move along. But you are responsible for you, and the other person is responsible for their reactions to things. Okay? Rule number 2. This one, I would probably need too much paper to really word this the way it should be worded, because it really should be worded in the following way. Never, 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 never assume. Now, I just heard that Steve and Susan are going to be celebrating their 25th wedding anniversary, 40th wedding anniversary. You got to know each other a little bit to be together that long, right? Except that we are so multi-layered and so deep in, so complicated in who we are that it is really never a good idea to, you think you know what's going on. I always tell my clients, okay, who in this room has 3 degrees in behavioral science? Who's been at this for more than 4 decades And if anybody should be able to read a person like a book, it ought to be somebody like me, right? It's my second rule. Don't do this. That, when I walk into a room of my family and I see things happening and I know what's going on, I am in big trouble right from the beginning. And this is the way it goes, isn't it? We're sitting there talking to our spouses and I see that look. Great. I know what that look means. That eyebrow means that it's like, don't do that. That is the most disrespectful thing you can do to another human being, especially to the one that you love the most in the world. Or we are talking to each other and I start out telling you something and you're sitting over there going, man, I know where this is going. I mean, I know him that well. I can finish his sentences for him. I know what he's going to say before he says it. Please stop doing that. Let's be quick to listen, slow to speak, and very, very slow to anger, as James says. That we need to slow down and really not jump ahead. Well, and so my rule of thumb, my tongue-in-cheek rule of thumb for rule number 2 is, after you've been married for 50 years, then I'll let you assume a few things. Except that for some reason, I keep attracting all these older clients. I don't know what happened. A few years ago, all these old, gray-haired people started to come to see me. I don't know why or where they came from. Medicare became a very, important part of my income. And now I've had some that have been married 50 years, and I probably need to change it to 60 now, because I see the 50-year married ones still who jump to conclusions, get off on the wrong foot, assume they know what's going on. We really need to stop doing this. So how do I do that? Well, that's rule number 3. Slow down, listen, make sure you understand. Now, this is communication 101. If you decided to go off to a Christian marriage retreat in Colorado somewhere and spend a whole weekend or maybe a whole week learning how to communicate better, which is great, by the way, and those are, there's some wonderful programs, they just hammer away on this one. Active listening, making sure that you really hear and understand what the other person says. I remember taking Communication 101 as a sophomore at Montana State University and going, I hate this class. This is stupid. It just seems so fundamental. And it was. And I realize now what an ignorant little putz that I was, because I should have really listened. And I think I do it better now in my old age than I ever did when I was in my 20s. Because this turns out to be very important. Now it's slow, it's cumbersome. It just seems like, come on, do we have to? Well, we've talked about this a million times. Yeah, and 1,000,001 could be the right one. I mean, it's like, as complicated as our lives are, don't become impatient and start to go through things. Be patient to slow down and really hear what the other person has to say. Make sense? Rule number 4, really watch your time and place. Go sit down somewhere. And this is really awkward. Brooke, who's now 25, when she was about 12 or 13, I remember this was a favorite word of hers. Awkward. And doing this would be a very awkward thing to do, to say, let's go in somewhere quiet, sit down like this, maybe 4 to 8 feet apart, looking at each other, and really make sure we hear what's going on. Well, Lou, you know what's going to happen. You go into a room and shut the door in this awkward situation. It's going to blow into a mushroom cloud. Sounds kind of like fear, doesn't it? And not like faith. Because I am convinced that 3-minute intense conversation could save you a 3-hour bloodbath or a 3-day Cold War. To just stop and really make sure you hear what the other person says. And this is why this is why it's such a part of wisdom, this part of it. Because if we don't really stop and listen to each other's points of view, by nature, we just go this way. We go opposites. And then the idea of unity or coming together is just completely lost. So we really need to sit down, slow down, really hear what the other person has to say. Now, an example of that would be, so you're driving along in a car. Okay, you kind of meet a lot of the criteria. We're 4 to 8 feet apart. We're close, in an enclosed environment. But one person is doing something that's fairly important and a bit distracting. And so, I'm sitting there driving along and we're having some intensive conversation. And all of a sudden I hear from the other seat the following. Was there an eye roll associated with that? Or was it a, you're really right, this is so deep and so good? And so that's not usually what we assume, is it? It's usually we assume that they're mad, they're not saying anything, they're pulling away. And that's why in a car is not the best idea. Maybe you pull into the closest 7-Eleven, turn around and face each other and really talk it out for a few minutes. My dad used to try to do that, but if you don't stop that in the backyard, stop this car and you're going to have something to cry about. I'll give you something to cry about. Generally, that's not exactly the way you want to lead into it. But, and that's most of the time what our kids think if we pull over the car, that it's going to be some sort of a blow up. Or all of a sudden, she hears from my side the following clear communique. Did you catch that? I just tisked. Now, am I mad and disgusted and really want to pull over this car and get out and walk home? Or was it that broccoli cheese soup that I had a little bit, for dinner? All you got to do is misread one of those and you're off to the races. Unless you slow down, don't assume, take responsibility for living in your faith and not living in your fear. You kind of with me so far? Now we get to rule number 5. This one, some of my colleagues would take me to task on, but I'll stand behind this. I think if you put emotions on a 1 to 10 scale, my pretty hard, fast, pseudo-Nazi rule here is don't ever go above a 3 and continue to talk. Well, Lou, why do you pick a 3? Well, if you and I are in Harmons, standing in row number 4, aisle number 4, and all of a sudden I hear somebody in aisle number 5 raising their voice and starting to get to this level. I don't know about you, but I'm starting to get pretty nervous because in this day and age, I'm kind of waiting for a pop, pop, pop to take place, right? I mean, do you not feel that way if you're in a grocery store? I don't want to be sitting in a doctor's office and hear somebody's voice going up in the background because I don't know what's coming out of that room next. We know this in public, and yet we walk into our homes with the people that we love the most and just throw this rule right out the window. Look at work. Do you go? I hope you don't work in an environment where people are above a 3 a lot, because those tend to become very toxic work environments. There are some groups of workers that kind of pride themselves in that. We're a construction crew, blankety blank. That's the way we blankety blank do everything. And grow up or wear a dress and spend some time around that. And you just know that this is not good for anybody. You can't do it. We tend to think about the military being that way a lot. Well, go along on a Navy SEALs mission sometime. Go sit in the back of the F-16 that Mark's flying. You are not going to hear voices that are up like that. I remember back when the Gulf War was happening, there were some Saudi Arabia fighter pilots who got into an air battle. And this one particular guy shot down 2 or 3 fighter planes. But the funny thing and it stands out now, how many years has it been since the Gulf War, is that he is screaming at the top of his lungs while he's, in the middle of this dogfight, and I just thought, you are not going to hear, I hope we are not going to hear an American pilot who's doing that, because it doesn't work. And yet, how many of us as dads or as moms have lost it with our kids and feel very justified because we're in that role? It is my belief that you can be way scarier if you keep yourself in that 2 to 3 range than if you're going off on them all the time. My dad was a yeller, and I have a pretty thick forehead to anyone. I mean, I can be at the grocery store and have somebody at a 5 or a 6, and I was well trained. But as he aged, and some of you met him, he visited a couple times when he lived with us from 90 to right up to his 95th birthday. And ironically, he had really mellowed out. I think he had lived through a lot of these. And, don't get me wrong, he was a World War II bomber pilot, hero, won about every medal that you can this side of the Medal of Honor. But boy, was he a yeller. And as I grew up and kind of saw that a lot of that came out of the fear that his kids would grow up to embarrass him. And once I think we got to a stage where he realized we weren't complete mutants and we're going to come out okay, then he was he was way more fun with his step-grandparents or step-grandkids than he was his own, because he was older and wiser. And ironically, I was way more scared of him. When he, I always thought when he got down to 135 pounds, I could finally take him. He's 94 years old, and yet he was scarier to me because he was more gentle and kind. And if he asked me to do something, I would have done anything for him at that point. And I think we need to remember that lesson. You don't have to be angry and yelling to be able to maintain power. And I do believe that, these lines represent discipline and limits, and we need to enforce those. But it's so much smarter when you're proactive about it. Be strategic, plot behind their backs. It's two adults against kids, right? If we get away into that room that we were talking about in rule number 4 and start to plot, we are way more scary than if we just give them the whole thing. After I'd seen my dad sort of blow the whole thing at me, it was like, what's left, right? Coaches talked about that, that coaches who would yell and scream, to this day, I just don't have any desire or closeness to them. And the ones that were softer and quieter, I would have cut off an arm for. So what do? We all get angry, but don't sin when you're in your anger, Paul says. So we need to step back. We need to take some space. We need to take a pause, whether that's at work, at home, or at church. Now, here's the tricky part. When you step away and walk away from your spouse, that could be as affrontive as if I picked up my coffee mug and threw it full strength as I walked out the door. So this rule has 3 sub-rules to it. The 1 to 3 rule, I call it. How do you walk out on somebody in a proactive way? Sub-rule number 1, never leave the room or hang up the phone until you have done everything humanly possible to get their permission. It goes something like this. Honey, you know that stupid rule that Dr. Lou has about the 1 to 3 thing? It's like, I'm about a 12 right now, and I really need to take a break. The magic words are, is that okay with you? And if you're sitting anywhere within the sound of my voice, it needs to be okay with you 99.8% of the time. Because if you stay there and duke it out and go toe to toe, you are going to say things that will take months to recover from. We pride ourselves in our boldness and our openness and our bluntness, and we end up paying a huge price. James is also the one who talks about little tiny sparks setting the cheatgrass on fire, which set the sagebrush on fire, which end up burning down 100,000 acres, would be our Utah example of that. And that's the tongue. And we won't get into that, but that's, easily one we could turn to go look at what the tongue can do. We need to slow down. Understand that marriage is a dance. We love the closeness of it. We love those close, fuzzy, intimate times. Unrealistic for it to be like that all times. Gluing someone, from shoulder to leg together with their spouse would be torture. It would be putting them in prison. Space is just as important in the dance as closeness. But it's the rhythm that really then becomes challenging. So that's why when you separate, it's really important for both of you to buy off on that. Well, now what's the problem? So, I gave her space to go take some time. How much time? Am I left here to just flap in the breeze for the next 2 hours, 2 days, 2 weeks? So sub rule number 2 is never leave the room until you have set a specific time to come back together to finish this thing. So it goes like this. So I'm kind of at a 12. I really need to take a break. Could you give me about 15 minutes? And I'm a pretty big fan of about 15 to 20 minutes. So was Paul. Be angry, but do not sin. Don't let the sun go down on your anger. Mike.
I don't want this to be a distraction from what you're saying, but be angry, but do not text. Because none of the visual clues, none of the body language,
Yeah.
none of the vocalization is picked up in a text. Worst possible way to communicate.
Yep. Text is a wonderful, incredible tool for doing small factual things. No, it wasn't 5:30, it was 6:00. No, not that kind of bread, this kind of bread. Perfect, wonderful for little short things. Our kids' generations are just out of control with it. I mean, I had a couple that divorced via text not long ago. And you're right, you can't see the person. It's not nearly interactive enough. And so this is really part of rule number 4. I need to add this to rule number 4. Really watch your media. What media do you use? Because there are certain things that are applicable with text. There are some things that are good with email. There are some things that are okay with phone mail. But you really need to know when it needs to be a face-to-face conversation and really pick your media correctly, or it'll lead to a lot of problems. So coming back together then after 15 minutes, you go, and even then, don't go distract yourself by pulling out your phone and checking all the sports scores. Because when you're angry, you look for something to distract yourself. I go turn on the TV and watch ESPN or something. Don't do that. I want you to go into a dark room, get into a comfortable position, take a few deep cleansing breaths, and decide, what are you so afraid of? Because as I said a couple of weeks ago, anger management is almost always fear management of what's over on the opposite side. And we men have a very, very difficult time admitting that or really getting to that. No, I am not afraid. I am angry because she da 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 da. Anybody sitting in that room looking from the outside would see that it's fear and insecurity that's typically propelling that. That's really where the gas is at that makes us angry. Sam?
I was going to just kind of piggyback off of what Mike was saying of the, like you said, the medium that you're using to communicate. And with text, not only do you have text or email or whatever, right? Something that's not verbal, or especially, in person, right? Because body language is 70 or 88% of your communication. And so not like it goes along with your other point, I think, of the not assuming, right? And, oh, well, I know them. I know what this face looks, and it's like, we don't know the other person's mind, like God knows, right? And so it's easy, even more easy via text to jump to those conclusions, because you're picking up things out of the text that you think of them, and maybe even societal cues, right? And all these things are lost by cheapening that form of communication, I think.
Yeah. And my emphasis would be, don't let body language be 80% of your communication, because it's very messy and it's very hard to know what it really means. Put words to it. Sit down. I mean, think about how hard it is, even when we're talking, to use the right words to describe the way I'm feeling. Let's sit down and really talk it out. So here we are coming back together after 15 or 20 minutes. Now, there is a third rule. And the third rule says, and this is if you're not underneath the same roof, make sure you're clear about what the purpose and the ground rules are. So if we're at home under the same roof, you split for a little period of time, good. But one of you could be on a business trip somewhere. One of you could be walking out the door for a really important meeting. That's okay. It could be tonight at 7:30. It could be tomorrow at 7 when I get back. That's okay. But the longer it is, the more you need to be really clear what the ground rules are. Can I trust that you're not going to go get in the car with your girlfriends and go to Wendover and do something that both of us regret? Can she trust that I'm not going to go empty out every bank account? So in the more difficult situations, sub rule number 3 becomes important. So now we've taken the break, we've stepped apart from each other, we both agreed to that. Now we come back together. Rule number 6. When you come back together, put the focus on the solution and don't just fight over the facts. And all of these are pretty much common sense, but when you start trying to work them, this one is very difficult to do because we have to talk about the past a little bit, but every couple that I see, they err by going over the facts and arguing about the facts. And pretty soon we're arguing and that train is off the tracks and headed down the mountain. It's going to end up in a fireball and we're not going to Chicago like we wanted to. Where do you want to go with this? What would your solution be? What would you rather have me do next time? How could we do this better next time around? And that sounds so simple, but it is really difficult to get yourself into that mindset. And especially if you're above a 3, it's just impossible to do. Where are you going with this? What do you want? Do you have any idea in your mind what you want? Because I often know what I don't want. And it's not this. Every time you da-da-da-da-da. And I can't believe that anybody with half a brain would have. And we're off. We're done. We're gone. And where are we going with this thing? Do I really have a sense of what the solution could be? And that you start thinking future instead of being so caught in the past. Does that make sense? And again, I know how simple that sounds. This one in practice is maybe the hardest of all of them to do. Because I just don't know what I really want. And when I do, it spoils the whole mood. All that righteous indignation I had built up, it was just it's almost intoxicating to know that you're right. Instead of stopping and going, okay, so you're right about what went wrong, but does that have anything to do with what you want to do next? What you would do next time? So these are 6 things that I think everybody just needs to really brush up on. Harry?
Just to expand on that point, and point number 5, when you're taking that time, this is something I struggle with a lot. You can take that time to sharpen your argument, perfect your points, and come back in and absolutely prove why your point of view is right, and completely lose the argument emotionally. I find it much more helpful to take that time to think of things that I can sacrifice in this situation and present to the other person how I can change, rather than come back in. Like I said, it's intoxicating to know that you're right. It's intoxicating to know that you have that point that just drives home. But if you use that, you're right, but you've still lost.
Yep. So this is why I think, why I felt like we needed one class on this. This, of course, could be a 10-part series in itself. But when we're trying to find wisdom and really make smart decisions, you've got to put on love, which is the perfect bond of unity. You've got to put on love to fulfill all the law and the prophets. That if you're not doing it right, if you're not doing it this way, then all the rightness in the world won't make any sense. And this is where you see really, really wise men like David and Solomon who really messed up their lives because they didn't let this rule them. They didn't let this rule them. And so they were smart and they made, good, smart decisions for other people. But when they were in the midst of battle, sometimes they made some pretty bad decisions themselves, as do we, as could we. So this is kind of the final piece to the puzzle, I think. This is basically a 3-dimensional model that I use in therapy with all of my clients. That, my feeling is that you can't really make lasting change in your life unless you're hitting all 3 of these areas. You really have to individually, constantly, daily work to identify this and get out of this and put it into faith. You need to constantly be working on engineering your life and how big our lives are today, because if you're feeling a lot of stress, sometimes stress management is stressor management. It's not just shifting here. This is the first place to start, but then you've really got to be smart. But then if we walk into our relationships, because what causes more stress in our relationship, what causes more stress in our lives than our relationships do? And that's easy. There's nothing that will really put us deeper into depression or higher into anxiety than if our relationships are going badly. Well, these 6 rules kind of give us a way to be able to try to manage those, to be able to use those again at work, at home, at our churches. It's just, I think everything we need to solve, and there is a lot with, this large of a congregation, this large of a building, these large personalities, surely not, that we have, and to go, look at what we can do if we follow the 6 rules and really live in love. Then we can make decisions that really are typically often what the world would see is a congregation that clicks on all cylinders, that, things come off and they feel good. And I see that when a function is really well organized, how it can look like it just came off with no organization, because often then you don't see the organization underneath it. Well, that takes a lot of love and patience while we're making those decisions about anything that we see. I hope this has been helpful. I hope it will give you kind of a framework to be able to think about things with, because we know that life isn't going to change in that regard. We have an enemy out there who loves to throw things at us, to try to mess up our Thanksgivings, to try to mess up our Christmases, to try to mess up our New Year's. And working with all 3 of these areas, I think, is a great way to then have the wisdom to start out with 2023 on a good note. Would you bow with me for a final word of prayer? Father, thank you for being with us through this study. We pray that your wisdom can just come into us. You promise to give it to us, to show us how to be able to find our way in this very difficult, challenging, and even dark life that we are facing every day out there in the world. But God, you've given us the tools that we need. Help us to trust you, to believe in you. Help us to read your word and to reason out the things that you've given us to help us find where these lines are at. But God, especially, thank you for your love that you've poured out on us, your forgiveness and grace, that you forgive us and reboot us over and over and over again, so that we can find our way through these difficult times. In Jesus' name, amen.